Whether it's luck, circumstance, or hard work, we were all teenagers. All kids make mistakes, and there should be consequences that come from those mistakes. But I think throughout this series, what we've really tried to highlight is that there should be some degree of proportionality for those consequences, certainly a system that is perceived as fair by youth, but also really significantly what happens after the youth's first point of contact with the justice system and what tools and services can be available to them in order to help them get back on a path for lifetime success in our communities.
And so once we push past this concept of basic safety and basic constitutional rights, we have an opportunity to think more expansively about how we invest in programs and practices in custodial settings that can help young people turn things around. We have had recent guidelines from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education around correctional education just last month. And so these are important steps that we can take, investments that we can be making in helping young people to set their lives on a very different path. And finally, the other question we should be asking is if we manage to transform our custodial system so that we have investments in working with these young people to help them improve their education and their mental health and to increase their belief that their lives can be something other than what maybe they thought before they became involved in the justice system.
And you'll see a lot of the research will show this, but to be able to have that early engagement, that consistent engagement with a young person during the pre-release stage, and to be able to then set up the groundwork and the framework for the transition to be smooth is a huge gift for us to be able to do effective work with young people. And so, and a lot of young people, whether it be in the juvenile setting or the adult, they'll have a variety of folks that'll come in contact with them in provision of services. But to be able to have one person that will stick with them no matter what, whether it be 6 months prior to release or a year prior to release, has been, I think, a huge asset for us to be able to build that relationship. And so I think a big piece of what we think about and a big piece of what drives our youth workers is to make sure that there is some type of systematized way to make sure that those young people don't have that social capital. For whatever circumstance didn't have that they can get pulled back into it.
Capturing savings from closures of state correctional facilities and shifting those to more research-supported community interventions is a really critical piece to institutional change. You can't just close something and do nothing, or you can't say you want to have something that works and not reinvest those dollars into those programs. So while much work remains, a clear course, I think, has been set in Ohio. How we treat children in these institutions directly impacts how they're going to do when they return home.
What can you do to advance the cause of juvenile justice? Outside the requirement that we look at status offenders in the justice system, keeping them out of detention, jail removal, keeping kids who are arrested out of county jails, and if they're there, the sight and sound compliance monitoring to make sure that if they're in a jail, they're not within sight or sound contact of adults, and finally, disproportionate minority contact. We have treatment. We have responses to almost every single behavioral problem for a kid. Some of it is simply mental health. Some of it's substance abuse. Some of it is trauma in their lives. Some of it is substance abuse that has started and may have intercepted that kid's life. We can provide that treatment at home, in home communities. Community-based alternatives are not only extraordinarily cheaper, they're also extraordinarily more effective than sending a kid to prison.
Systems are moving away from the use of isolation as a behavior management technique. Unfortunately, some staffs don't know how to deal. They haven't been trained to deal with kids, or they've been there too long, and their management approach is if the kid does something wrong, you lock the kid down. That is so contraindicated for anybody, especially for a juvenile, if you're trying to change their behavior and then you're separating them from the rest of the population. A successful reintegration often starts with a successful reentry program. In the PBS, reintegration standards measure the effectiveness of a facility's reentry program. So the goal of reintegration is to prepare a youth and their families and social supports for each youth's successful reintegration into the community. The reintegration standards actually are being revised right now, but these are the general areas of the standards. That a case plan needs to be developed within 15 days of the youth coming into the facility. All the time I go out to these conferences, I hear lip services paid to reintegration. It ought to begin on the first day. Unfortunately, many times it begins a few days before the kid. That's not too true anymore, but it used to, a few days before the youth was leaving the facility. The facility staff must develop linkages with community staff and the aftercare staff. The case manager visits and develops positive in-person relationships with the youth while they are in the facility, and youths have appropriate services and supports when they're released to the community.